Hi, Aqua Roomers. Time for chapter reading. So we're starting the chapter called Harvest. So harvesting takes place end of the summer, just before fall begins, okay? Pa and Uncle Henry traded work. When the grain got ripe in the fields, Uncle Henry came to work with Pa, and Aunt Polly and all the cousins came to spend the day. Then Pa went to help Uncle Henry cut his grain, and Ma took Laura and Mary and Carrie to spend the day with Aunt Polly. Ma and Aunt Polly worked in the house, and all the cousins played together in the yard till dinner time. Aunt Polly's yard was a fine place to play because the stumps were so thick. The cousins played jumping from stump to stump without ever touching the ground. Even Laura, who was the littlest, could do this easily in the places where the smallest trees had grown close together. Cousin Charlie, remember yesterday? I told you won't believe what he does. Okay, here we go. Cousin Charlie was a big boy, going on 11 years old, and he could jump from stump to stump all over the yard. The smaller stumps, he could jump 2 at a time, and he could walk on top of the top rail of the fence without being afraid. Pa and Uncle Henry were out in the field cutting the oats with cradles. A cradle was a sharp steel blade fastened to a framework of wooden slats that caught and held the stalks of grain while the blade cut them. Pa and Uncle Henry carried the cradles by their long curved handles and swung the blades into the standing oats. When they had cut enough to make a pile, they slid the cut stalks off the slats into neat heaps on the ground. It was hard work, walking around and around the field in the hot sun with both hands swinging the heavy cradles into the grain and cutting it, then sliding it into the piles. So, after they cut everything, they scooped it together, bundled piles, and then they made them stand up. That's hard. After all the grain was cut, they must go over the field again. This time, they would stoop over each pile, taking up a handful of the stalks in each hand, and they would knot them together to make a longer strand. Then, gathering up the pile of grain in their arms, they would bind it tightly around with the band they had made and tie the band and tuck in the ends. After they made 7 such bundles, then the bundles must be shocked. To make a shock, they stood 5 bundles upright, snugly together, with the oat head up. Then over these, they put 2 more bundles, spreading out the stalks to make a little roof and shelter the 5 bundles from dew and rain. Every stalk of cut grain must always be safely in the shock before dark, for lying on the dewy ground all night would spoil it. Pa and Uncle Henry were working very hard because the air was so heavy and hot and still that they expected rain. The oats were ripe, and if they were not cut and in the shock before the rain came, the crop would be lost. Then Uncle Henry's horses would be hungry all winter. At noon, Pa and Uncle Henry came to the house in a great hurry, swallowed their dinner as quickly as they could. Uncle Henry said that Charlie must come and help them that afternoon. Laura looked at Pa when Uncle Henry said that. At home, Pa had said to Ma that Uncle Henry and Aunt Polly spoiled Charlie. When Pa was 11 years old, he had done a good day's work every day in the fields, driving a team. But Charlie did hardly any work at all. Now, Uncle Henry said that Charlie must come to the field. He could save them a great deal of time. He could go to the spring for water. He could fetch them the water jug when they needed a drink. He could fetch the whetstone when the blades needed sharpening. All the children looked at Charlie. Charlie did not want to go to the field. He wanted to stay in the yard and play, but of course he did not say so. Pa and Uncle Henry did not rest at all. They ate in a hurry and they went right back to work, and Charlie went with them. Now, Mary was the oldest. She wanted to play a quiet, ladylike game. So in the afternoon, the cousins made a playhouse in the yard. The stumps were chairs and tables and stoves, and leaves were dishes, and sticks were the children. On the way home that night, Laura and Mary heard Pa tell Ma what happened in the field. Instead of helping Pa and Uncle Henry, Charlie was making all the trouble that he could. He got in their way so they couldn't swing the cradles. He hid the whetstone so they had to hunt for it when the blades needed sharpening. He didn't bring the water jug till Uncle Henry shouted at him 3 or 4 times, and then he was sullen. After that, he followed them around, talking and asking questions. They were working too hard to pay attention to him, so they told him to go away and not bother them. But they dropped their cradles and ran to him across the field when they heard him scream. The woods were, there were snakes in the oats all around the field, filled in the woods. And when they got to Charlie, there was nothing wrong. And he laughed at them. He said, "I fooled you that time." Pa said if he had been Uncle Henry, he would have tanned that boy's hide for sure. But Uncle Henry did not do it. So they took a drink of water and they went back to work. 3 times Charlie screamed, and they ran to him as fast as they could, and he laughed at them. He thought it was a good joke. And still, Uncle Henry did not tan his hide, and you know that means giving him a spanking. And then a 4th time he screamed, louder than ever. Pa and Uncle Henry looked at him. He was jumping up and down, screaming. Well, they saw nothing wrong with him, and they had been fooled so many times. They went about their work. Charlie kept on screaming, louder and shriller. Pa did not say anything. Uncle Henry said, "Let him scream." So they went on working, and they let him scream. He kept on jumping up and down, screaming. He did not stop. At last, Uncle Henry said, "Maybe something is really wrong." They laid down their cradles, and they went across the field to him. And all that time, Charlie had been jumping up and down on a yellow jacket's nest. Look at that. Oh my goodness. Wow. The yellow jackets lived in a nest in the ground, and Charlie stepped on it by mistake. Then all the little bees in their bright yellow jackets came swarming out with their red-hot stings, and they hurt Charlie so that he couldn't get away. He was jumping up and down, and hundreds of bees were stinging him all over. They were stinging his face, his hands, his neck, his nose. They were crawling up his pants legs and stinging and crawling down the back of his neck and stinging. The more he jumped and screamed, the harder they stung. Pa and Uncle Henry took him by the arms and ran him away from the yellow jacket's nest. They undressed him, and his clothes were full of yellow jackets and their stings and were swelling him up all over. They killed the bees that were stinging him, and they shook the bees out of his clothes, and then they dressed him and they sent him to the house. Laura and Mary and the cousins were playing quietly in the yard when they heard a loud blubbering cry. Charlie came bawling into the yard. His face was so swollen that the tears could hardly squeeze out of his eyes. His hands were puffed up. His neck was puffed out. His cheeks were big, hard puffs. His fingers stood stiff and swollen. There were little hard white dents all over his puffed out face and neck. Laura and Mary and the cousins stood and looked at him. Ma and Aunt Polly came running out of the house, asked him what was the matter. Oh, Charlie blubbered and bawled. Ma said it was yellow jackets. She ran to the garden and got a big pan of dirt, while Aunt Polly took Charlie into the house and undressed him. They made a big panful of mud, and they plastered him all over with it. They rolled him up in an old sheet, put him to bed. His eyes were swollen shut, and his nose was a funny shape. Ma and Aunt Polly covered his whole face with mud and tied the mud on with cloths. Only the end of his nose and his mouth showed. Would you look at that? Look at Cousin Charlie. He is so swollen everywhere. And the cousins are just shocked. They've never seen anything like that. Did you know that mud really does help swelling go down? Did you know that? Oh, people always used mud. Really good for yellow jacket stings. Aunt Polly steeped some herbs and gave him some for his fever. Laura and Mary and the cousins stood around for some time looking at him. It was dark that night when Pa and Uncle Henry came from the field. All the oats were in shock, and now the rain could come, and it would not do any harm. Pa could not stay to supper. He had to get home and do the milking. The cows were already waiting at home, and when cows are not milked on time, they don't give so much milk. He hitched up quickly, and they all got to the wagon. Pa was very tired, and his hands ached, so he could not drive very well. But the horses knew the way. Ma sat beside him with baby Carrie, and Laura and Mary sat on the board behind them. And then they heard Pa tell about what Charlie had done. Laura and Mary were horrified. They were often naughty themselves, but they never imagined anyone could be as naughty as Charlie had been. And we will read the rest of what happens in that chapter tomorrow. It was good, boys and girls. Oh my goodness. We'll hear what Laura and Mary have to say. Until next time, until tomorrow.